Hi, it's Mike DelSignore. In this video, I want to talk about what happens if you took a breathalyzer. How can you still win your case when you're charged with OUI? I'm a Massachusetts OUI lawyer. I've handled cases all over Massachusetts for the last 15 years, and I've won a lot of cases involving breath tests, and there's a few ways that I've done that. First, I've gone to a lot of advanced trainings on breathalyzer evidence. I've learned the science of how a breath test measures a result, and I'm able to use that knowledge in court to potentially get the results excluded from evidence. Now, not all breath tests get excluded, but I've had many cases where my clients have been found not guilty despite breathalyzer evidence. So the number one takeaway I want you to have from this video is don't just resolve your case because the breath test is over the legal limit. You might even talk to another attorney and they might say, okay, why don't you take a quaff, the breath test is over the limit. If you don't get a detailed discussion of potential defenses in breath test cases, then you might not have an attorney that really does a lot of OUI work. If they can't really detail how you can still win the case with a breathalyzer in the case, you might have someone that just is rushing you into a plea because there's a breath test. So let me explain how I get the test knocked out. So there's certain rules and regulations that the government must follow in order for a breath test to be admissible in court. In other words, just because you took the test doesn't mean the result is going to come into evidence in court. So let's say you're on the road and you took a breath test back at the station and it came out to 0.14. Well, if that result is excluded from evidence, then it's not known to a judge or a jury. The judge would know it, but the judge wouldn't consider it in evaluating the case. So when the breath test is knocked out of evidence, the case is just based on the observations. It's almost as if you refused. So then the observations of the odor of alcohol, your driving, how you did on the field test, governs whether you're going to be found guilty or not guilty of OUI. The breath test is not even considered in that case. So what I'll do is I set the case up for a hearing, what they call a motion in limine. Some courts call it a motion to suppress, but first way I challenge a breathalyzer is there's a procedure that's supposed to watch you for 15 minutes prior to the test. So step one in any case with a breath test is I try to get any video, because if there's a video of the booking process, often there's going to be an issue with the 15 minutes. So the officer is supposed to watch you and make sure you don't burp, hiccup, regurgitate. And the reason this is because if any of those things happen and there are other things could cause contamination in the sample. So in other words, mouth alcohol. If the alcohol is not, if the sample is not measuring what was known as deep lung air, then it's not an accurate reflection of your blood alcohol. Now, there's other reasons why this whole science of breath testing is inaccurate, but that's at least the theory that they're operating on. So if the alcohol is trapped in your esophagus, if you burp, then it's not measuring deep lung air, and the alcohol percentage is going to be higher. So they're supposed to watch you for 15 minutes, and when we get videos, we see that there's breaks in these observations. If there's any break in the observation period should be restarted. If it's not restarted, we can show that to a judge, the results should be excluded. Other things that can result in a breath test being kept out of evidence is they have to prove that you consented to the test. Often you will consent. A lot of times consent's not an issue, but that's another requirement. So the 15 minutes is probably the most common way a breath test can get knocked out of evidence. The second most common is certain documents that the government must produce in evidence in order for these breath tests to come into evidence. So we can look at those documents, make sure they have the right witnesses in order to get the test into evidence. So the government can't just show up and say the machine's perfect, it spitted out a result. They have to prove that in court, and often they won't have what they need to make these determinations. There's some current issues now with the breath test. So back in 2000, and it probably started 2013, I had at least 30 clients join what was known as basically the consolidated 9510 litigation. The case name was Commonwealth versus Ananias. And in that case, what myself and other lawyers who were involved in the litigations, we basically challenged the scientific accuracy of the test. We arguing that things like the blood-breath partition ratio weren't accurate. and all these different challenges. And that litigation, ultimately, the judge denied the motion to exclude the breath test on the scientific arguments, but those are still valid arguments. I'm going to talk about them in this video. But he ultimately excluded a lot of breath tests, 2 years worth of breath tests, because the government hadn't showed a proper procedure for the annual certification. The judge ultimately then allowed breath tests to come back in evidence when the Office of Alcohol Testing became accredited. But recently there's been some issues where the breath test has produced a result when the forms haven't been signed by the officer. So the breath test is supposed to operate in a certain way, and we have evidence just recently that the machine isn't operating the way OAT intends it. I had a case back in 2013, 2014, where my client took a breathalyzer and there was an error, mouth alcohol. The machine, if it's working properly, isn't supposed to allow another sample for 15 minutes because mouth alcohol, there has to be a 15-minute observation. The person took another test in 7 to 8 minutes. I had that result excluded, but it was a perfect example of the machine not operating the way the Office of Alcohol Testing intended it. This recent issue is another example. So there's an issue with the software, how this machine operates, that must be presented in court because this machine isn't reliable as people think. It's not accurate. It kind of operates in ways that no one understands. Certainly the government doesn't have a witness from the Office of Alcohol Testing to come in and explain why the machine is operating in a way that it wasn't intended. What are some of the other ways breath test evidence can be attacked? Well, first, it makes assumptions, assumes everyone's the same. So when you take a breath test, the machine is programmed to assume that everyone has a blood-breath partition ratio of 21/100 If your ratio is higher or lower than that, the result is going to be inaccurate. So in other words, the machine is making an assumption that everyone's the same, and no one has a blood partition ratio of 21/100 That is essentially an average, something that was computed. So the machine basically, it's making an assumption that could make your results, it could underreport your results or it could overreport your results. No one knows what your blood-breath partition ratio is. So that's a flaw in breath testing. It also assumes everyone's, the breath temperature is the same. If your breath temperature is elevated, it can increase the results and make the results higher. Now there is an attachment that they purchased in Alabama that could account for a person's body breath temperature. We don't purchase that attachment in Massachusetts. So we have unknowns, we have variables that are unaccounted for. And basically the logic is the breath test machine is just sort of approximating. It's making all these assumptions. We don't know if they're accurate. So your breath test could be much lower than the government is claiming it is. And they don't have, and these flaws aren't inherent with a blood test. If you have a blood test, you're not going to have all these assumptions and these flaws and averages. Another problem with the breath test is, in addition to, so you got the assumption about blood-breath partition ratio, number one, you got a temperature assumption, and and the breath test reading is going to vary in terms of how long or how hard you breathe into the machine. So the longer it takes you to blow into the machine, studies have shown that it inflates the results. Now, the Office of Alcohol Testing would deny that, but there's been independent studies that have shown that the time of the breath into the machine can artificially increase the results. What are some other problems? Your medical problems could affect the results. If you have asthma, it's more likely that that alcohol is going to get trapped in the esophagus, the trachea, and that the machine is not reading deep lung air. So asthma could potentially impact the results. If you have GERD, you can have gases that aren't coming up and impacting the results. In other words, alcohol is going to be trapped not in the deep lung air, but it's going to be coming up through your trachea, through your lungs, and it's going to artificially inflate the breath test results. So you have all these flaws with breath testing. You have assumptions the machine makes. You have the issue that the machine is not acting as OAT intended, and you have other medical conditions that it can impact the reliability of the machine. When you require the government to prove that the machine's accurate and reliable, there's a lot of different things they got to comply with, and often they can't meet that burden. So in a breath test case, it will certainly take a little longer, and sometimes and you're gonna have to be patient. But if you hire a lawyer that really understands this, you put the government through each and every hurdle, oftentimes the breath test won't come into evidence, and your case will proceed just based on the observations. Now, when you take a breath test, you only lose your license for 30 days. After 30 days, you have your full license back. So you'll be driving while your lawyer is fighting the case in court and coming up and investigating the machine, coming up with these arguments to present in court to convince the judge the results are not reliable. There are some other issues with the machine as well. Let's say your breath test is close to the legal limit. Let's say it's 0.08, 0.09. There's a margin of error. So if you have a 0.08, 0.09, you should definitely consider fighting that case, because considering the margin of error in the machine, when it tests every breath test machine, when it gives a sample, this is how it works. So the machine does an ear blank, then your test, ear blank, then it does what it calls a calibration. Calibrates a known solution that's supposed to be 0.08. If this calibration reads anywhere from 0.074 to 0.086, that's considered reliable. Then it does another ear blank and then your test results. So there's even when it's testing this gas jar, basically this sample made in a lab, it allows for a 0.006 margin of error. When a person breathes into a breath test machine, there's far more variables than when you're testing a solution in a lab. So judges, juries understand that there's a margin of error that inherent in the machine. So we don't know if you're 0.08, if you're 0.07, even if you're 0.09, that could be a 0.07. When the machine registers a result, it measures it in 3 digits. So you'll see the printout and it might say 0.086. But when it comes into court, it gets rounded down to 0.08. And the reason is that that 3rd digit isn't accurate. So there's no way to know how precise that is. So the court doesn't use that in cases at trial. It's just rounded down. There's also the issue of time. So the breath test, it's not just, did you take a breath test and is there a result? What was your BAC at the time of driving? So if you took this test, an hour and a half later, and you're close to the limit, there's the argument that no one knows if your blood alcohol was going up or going down. So that's another argument that can be made in addition to the margin of error. It's most effective when the result is close to the legal limit. And certainly in cases like this, we can hire an expert. We can explain all these scientific arguments and why this machine is not accurate, reliable, why a jury shouldn't trust it. If a breath test is going to come into evidence, you don't have to resolve it. You can call it, you can get an expert, you could testify and ask the jury to consider whether they prove this machine is reliable. Especially if you look good in a video, if we can argue you did well in the field test, we can present what is commonly known as sort of a disconnect defense, where there's just the breath test results don't jive with the other observations. So if you look good in the video, if your field tests are good, and almost always, the office is never going to usually say you passed. Sometimes you'll see passed this test or did it satisfactory, but in most cases, there's going to be some stuff that they say you did wrong. Keep in mind, they don't write what you did correctly in the reports. So in a lot of cases, I'll be talking to somebody in my office or over the phone, and when I look at the report, I'll say, you did really well in this test. And I know it says you failed, but I know all the things the office is looking for, and they didn't see those. That means when I question the officer on the stand, he's going to acknowledge you walked out the correct number of steps, you kept your feet close together. So they might have commented that you missed 2 clues, but there's 8 clues on the 9-step walk and turn. When I can argue someone did 6 out of 8 things right, and when you multiply that by the fact that it's 18 times they're looking for each individual clue, we can present this in a completely different light. So if you took a breath test, feel free to call me. My passion is helping people charged with OUI cases. I understand the law. I'll do everything I can to present your case and have you found not guilty. A breath test isn't, for me, it's more of a speed bump. It's not something that when I see a breath test case, I think automatically we can't win that case. There's a lot, I've won a lot of breath test cases. There's a lot of problems with these machines, and we'll investigate it. I'll show you the different arguments we can make and go over the pluses and minuses of either taking a plea or fighting the case. Generally, what I do is I look at the case and I say, can we win this without the breath test? If the answer is yes, in many cases, the best course of action is to fight the case. So it's never too early too late to call me, 781-686-5924. I'm here to help. Been doing this for a very long time, and it's my passion to help people get their lives back together, put this case behind them, and move forward, because I know the impact of an OUI can have in terms of your job, your employment, and just your own emotional well-being and your own future. And if you have a second or third offense, you need somebody that knows the ins and outs of OUI defense and how to beat a breath test, because your third, your fourth offenses, you're looking at potential jail time. So feel free to contact me. Again, 781-686-5924. Call, text, call anytime.